The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bustling streets of downtown San Antonio, Texas. George Strait Jr. navigated his black Ford F-150 through the familiar roads, the radio softly playing one of his father's classic hits. At 28, George Jr. had inherited more than just his father's name. He possessed the same quiet strength and genuine heart that had made George Strait a legend in country music. As he stopped at a red light near the historic Majestic Square, something caught his eye. Seated against the weathered brick wall of an old building was a man who couldn't have been much older than himself. Despite the worn military jacket and the cardboard sign reading, "Veteran Anything Helps," there was an unmistakable dignity in the way the man sat. Straight-backed, eyes forward, never pleading or demanding attention from passers-by. George Jr. felt his chest tighten. The man's face bore the invisible weight that he'd seen in too many of his friends who'd returned from overseas deployments. The 1,000-yard stare, the careful way he positioned himself to see everyone approaching, the alert posture despite his obvious exhaustion. All telltale signs of someone who'd seen too much, survived too much, and was now struggling to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. The light turned green, but George Jr. couldn't drive away. He pulled into a nearby parking space and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His father had always taught him that with privilege comes responsibility, and that turning away from suffering when you had the power to help was a choice that would haunt you forever. Taking a deep breath, George Jr. stepped out of his truck and approached the veteran. As he got closer, he could see that despite the man's circumstances, his military jacket was clean, his beard neatly trimmed, and his few possessions organized with military precision. "Afternoon," George Jr. said quietly, respecting the man's personal space. "Mind if I ask your name?" The veteran looked up, his green eyes sharp and intelligent, despite the fatigue that surrounded them like a heavy cloak. "Marcus Thompson," he replied, his voice steady but hoarse. "Sergeant, 3rd Infantry Division, retired." "George Strait Jr.," came the response, and George Jr. watched as recognition flickered across Marcus's features, though the veteran's expression remained respectfully neutral. "I know who you are, son. Your daddy's music got me through some dark nights overseas." Marcus shifted slightly, wincing as if movement caused him pain. "Don't feel obligated to stop on my account. I'm not looking for handouts from celebrities." The response caught George Jr. off guard, not because of any rudeness, but because of the quiet pride that emanated from this man, even in his lowest moment. Here was someone who had served his country, who had sacrificed in ways most people would never understand. And yet he maintained his dignity even while asking for help. "How long have you been out here, Marcus?" George Jr. asked, settling down on a nearby concrete ledge, making himself available for conversation rather than looking down at the veteran. Marcus considered the question for a long moment. 3 weeks this time, was staying at the VA shelter, but he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Let's just say some of us don't do well in confined spaces anymore. Too many people, too much noise. My nerves got the better of me." George Jr. nodded, understanding more than Marcus might have expected. He'd heard similar stories from other veterans his family had encountered over the years. The transition from military life to civilian life was difficult enough, but when you added the invisible wounds of war, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the inability to feel safe in crowds, the challenge became almost insurmountable. "When did you last eat?" George Jr. asked, noticing the way Marcus's clothes hung loose on his frame. "Yesterday morning. Got some leftover breakfast from the diner down the street." Marcus's voice remained steady, matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than his own hunger. Without hesitation, George Jr. stood up. "There's a good barbecue place around the corner. Would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner?" Marcus looked up sharply. "I don't need your pity, son." "Not pity, George Jr. replied firmly. Respect. You served, you sacrificed, and right now you're going through a rough patch. That doesn't diminish who you are or what you've done. I'd like to buy you dinner because I respect what you've given for this country, and because I believe every person deserves dignity and a good meal. For the first time since their conversation began, Marcus's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. His eyes misted, and he looked away for a moment before meeting George Jr. His gaze again. All right, he said quietly. I'd appreciate that. As they walked toward the restaurant, George Jr. noticed how Marcus constantly scanned their surroundings, how he positioned himself to keep walls to his back, how he flinched slightly at unexpected sounds. The warrior was still very much present, even if the war was over. Over plates of brisket and cornbread, Marcus began to open up. He talked about his deployments in Afghanistan, about the brothers he'd lost, about coming home to a country that seemed to have forgotten there was still a war going on. He spoke of struggling with nightmares that left him afraid to sleep, of job interviews where his military experience seemed more like a liability than an asset, of a VA system that was overwhelmed and understaffed. The hardest part, Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is feeling invisible. You come home from a place where every day could be your last, where you're responsible for keeping your brothers alive, where everything you do matters desperately. And then you're back in a world where nobody seems to understand that you're still fighting a war, just a different kind. George Jr. listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of Marcus's words. He thought about his own comfortable life, his opportunities, his family's success, and felt the stark contrast with the reality facing the man across from him. You know, George Jr. said carefully, I think my dad would want to meet you. He's always had a special place in his heart for veterans. Would you be open to that? Marcus looked skeptical. I'm not looking for charity, George Jr. I've got pride, even if I don't have much else right now. It's not about charity, George Jr. assured him. It's about connection, about community. My dad believes that we're all in this together, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is let people who care about you help you find your footing again. As they finished their meal, George Jr. pulled out his phone. Dad, he said when the call connected, I'm here with someone I'd like you to meet. George Strait was in his home studio when his son's call came through. The legendary country singer had been reviewing some new material, his acoustic guitar resting across his lap, when the phone rang. Something in George Jr. His voice immediately caught his attention. There was an urgency there, but also a tenderness that told him this wasn't a casual conversation. Dad, I'm here with Marcus Thompson. He's a veteran, served in Afghanistan with the 3rd Infantry Division. He's going through a tough time right now, and I think you two should meet. George Sr. listened as his son briefly explained the situation, and without hesitation he said, Bring him over to the house, son. I'll put on some coffee. The drive to the Strait family ranch took about 40 minutes, and George Jr. could sense Marcus's growing nervousness as they approached the private gates. The veteran had cleaned up as best he could in the restaurant's bathroom, but he was clearly conscious of his appearance and circumstances. Marcus, George Jr. said as they pulled up the long driveway, my dad doesn't judge people by their circumstances. He judges them by their character. And from what I've seen today, you've got more character than most people I know. The ranch house was elegant but unpretentious, reflecting the down-to-earth nature of its famous owner. George Strait himself came out to greet them, and Marcus was struck by how the legend looked exactly like any other Texas rancher, jeans, boots, and a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Marcus Thompson, George Sr. said, extending his hand, it's an honor to meet you. My son tells me you served in Afghanistan. Yes, sir, 3 tours. Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the direct eye contact. There was no condescension, no pity, just respect between two men. "Come on in. My wife Norma's made some fresh coffee and I think we should sit and talk." The interior of the house was warm and inviting, filled with family photos and subtle reminders of George Sr.'s incredible career. Marcus noticed a particular wall dedicated to various honors and awards, but what caught his attention most were the photos with military personnel, images of George Sr. performing for troops overseas, visiting VA hospitals, and participating in various veteran support events. "You've done a lot for veterans over the years," Marcus observed as they settled in the comfortable living room. George Sr. nodded. "My brother served in Vietnam, came back changed, you know. Took him years to find his footing again. I've never forgotten what that looked like, how hard it was for him and for our family. When I got successful, I knew I wanted to give back to the men and women who sacrificed so much for our freedom." Norma Strait appeared with coffee and homemade cookies, greeting Marcus with the same warm acceptance as her husband. There was something about the family's genuine hospitality that began to chip away at the walls Marcus had built around himself. As they talked, George Sr. found himself deeply moved by Marcus's story. The veteran spoke about losing his squad leader, David Rodriguez, to an IED explosion that Marcus still felt responsible for. He talked about the guilt that haunted him, the way he'd isolated himself from friends and family upon returning home, and the gradual slide from struggling to get by to living on the streets. "The worst part," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "is feeling like David died for nothing. Like all of our sacrifice meant nothing because the country we came back to doesn't seem to care that there are still Americans fighting battles every single day, just different kinds of battles." George Sr. leaned forward, his expression intense. "Son, let me tell you something. Your sacrifice, David's sacrifice, it means everything. The problem isn't that it doesn't matter. The problem is that too many people don't know how to show that it matters, but that's something we can change." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. George Sr. exchanged a look with his son, and George Jr. could see the wheels turning in his father's mind, the same look he got when he was writing a song that meant something important to him. "I mean," George Sr. said slowly, "that maybe it's time to do more than just write checks to veteran organizations. Maybe it's time to get directly involved, to create something that makes a real difference in individual lives." Over the next 2 hours, an idea began to take shape. George Sr. talked about his resources, his connections in the business community, his platform as a respected public figure. George Jr. contributed ideas about social media, about reaching younger demographics, about creating sustainable programs rather than one-time charitable gestures. But it was Marcus who provided the crucial perspective, the insight into what veterans actually needed versus what people thought they needed. "Most of the programs focus on job training or housing," Marcus explained. "And those are important, don't get me wrong. But what a lot of us really need is purpose, community, and the feeling that our skills and experience still matter. We need to feel useful again, not just rescued." George Sr. nodded thoughtfully. "So, what if we created something that wasn't just about helping veterans, but about utilizing their unique skills and leadership abilities to help others? What if we found a way to make veterans the heroes of their own recovery stories?" As the evening progressed, the conversation evolved from abstract ideas to concrete plans. George Sr. made several phone calls, reaching out to contacts in the business community, local government, and veteran organizations. Each call was the same. He explained that he wanted to create something meaningful, something that would make a real difference, and he needed their help to make it happen. Marcus found himself amazed by the response. Within hours, George Sr. had commitments from local business owners to provide job opportunities, from city officials to help navigate bureaucratic obstacles, and from other celebrities who wanted to contribute to the effort. "This is incredible," Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder. "But why? Why are you doing all this for someone you just met?" George Sr. smiled, the same warm expression that had endeared him to millions of fans over the decades. "Marcus, my daddy taught me that we're all just walking each other home. Some of us have been blessed with resources, with opportunities, with platforms that can make a difference. If we don't use those blessings to help others, then what's the point of having them?" George Jr. watched his father with deep admiration. This was why George Strait was more than just a country music legend. He was a man who understood that true success was measured not by what you achieved for yourself, but by what you did to lift others up. As the night wound down, George Sr. made one final call to his longtime friend and business manager, Patricia Williams. He explained the situation and his vision for what they wanted to accomplish. "Patricia, I need you to set up a meeting with the San Antonio City Council, the local VA office, and representatives from at least 5 major employers in the area. We're going to create a comprehensive veteran support program, and I want it operational within 30 days. When he hung up the phone, Marcus was staring at him in disbelief. "Mr. Strait, I don't know what to say. This is beyond anything I ever imagined when I was sitting on that street corner this afternoon." "Don't say anything yet," George Sr. replied. "Let's see what we can actually accomplish. But I will tell you this. You're not going back to that street corner. Tonight, you're staying here. And tomorrow, we start building something that's going to change not just your life, but the lives of every veteran in this city who needs a hand up." As Marcus settled into the comfortable guest room that night, he lay awake thinking about the day's events. For the first time in months, he felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: hope. The next morning brought a whirlwind of activity that Marcus could hardly believe was real. He woke to the smell of bacon and coffee and found Norma Strait in the kitchen preparing a breakfast that could have fed a small army. "Good morning, Marcus," she said with a warm smile. "George Sr. is already on the phone with someone in Austin, and George Jr. is out feeding the horses. I hope you're hungry." As Marcus sat down to the most substantial meal he'd had in weeks, George Sr. appeared. Phone still pressed to his ear, his expression animated and determined. "Yes, Governor, I understand the bureaucracy involved, but this is about American heroes who served our country with honor. Surely we can expedite the process." "Yes, sir, I appreciate that." Thursday works perfectly. When he hung up, George Sr. turned to Marcus with a grin. "Well, son, we've got a meeting with the governor's office on Thursday to discuss state-level support for what we're doing. Turns out the governor's been looking for exactly this kind of public-private partnership." Marcus shook his head in amazement. "Mr. Strait, this is all happening so fast. Are you sure about this? I mean, you barely know me." George Sr. sat down across from him, his expression becoming serious. "Marcus, let me tell you something. I've been in the music business for over 4 decades. I've met thousands of people, and you learn to read character pretty quickly. Yesterday, when George Jr. called me, he didn't just tell me about a veteran who needed help. He told me about a man who maintained his dignity and pride even in his darkest hour, who refused charity but accepted respect, who served his country with honor and continues to carry that honor even when the world seems to have forgotten him." George Jr. came in from outside, his boots dusty from the morning chores. "Morning, Marcus. How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Marcus admitted. "Your parents have been incredibly kind." "They're good people," George Jr. agreed. "So what's the plan for today?" George Sr. pulled out a notepad covered with handwritten notes and phone numbers. "First, we're meeting with Rebecca Martinez at the San Antonio VA office at 10. She's the director there, and she's agreed to fast-track Marcus through their housing assistance program. Then at 1, we're meeting with Thomas Anderson. He owns Anderson Construction, one of the biggest builders in South Texas. He's looking for project managers, and Marcus's military experience makes him an ideal candidate. Marcus felt overwhelmed. I don't understand. Why is everyone so willing to help? What did you tell them? The truth, George Sr. replied simply, that we have an American hero who needs a hand up, not a handout, and that anyone who helps him is investing in something bigger than just one person's recovery. The meeting at the VA office went better than Marcus had dared to hope. Rebecca Martinez was a no-nonsense administrator who had served 2 tours in Iraq herself before transitioning to civilian service with the Department of Veterans Affairs. She understood the challenges Marcus faced because she'd lived them herself. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, reviewing his file, "your service record is exemplary. 3 tours, multiple commendations, leadership roles throughout your deployment. The question I have is, what do you need from us to get back on your feet?" Marcus looked at George Sr. and George Jr., still hardly believing this was happening. "I need housing, at least temporarily. I need help dealing with some of the mental health issues I've been struggling with. And I need to feel useful again." Rebecca nodded. "We can have you in transitional housing by this afternoon. I'm also going to set you up with Dr. Sarah Chen. She's our best PTSD counselor, and she specializes in working with combat veterans. As for feeling useful," she smiled, "Mr. Strait here has some interesting ideas about that." The meeting with Thomas Anderson was equally productive. Anderson, a weathered man in his 60s who had built his company from the ground up, took an immediate liking to Marcus's straightforward manner and obvious leadership qualities. "Son," Anderson said, "I've been looking for someone to oversee a major housing development project we're starting next month. It's a subdivision of homes specifically designed for veterans, adaptive features for those with disabilities, affordable pricing, close to VA services. I need someone who understands the military mindset, who can lead a diverse team, and who has the attention to detail that comes from military training." Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Mr. Anderson, I haven't worked in construction before, but I learn fast, and I've never failed to complete a mission." "That's exactly what I want to hear," Anderson replied. "The job starts at $60,000 a year, with full benefits and profit-sharing bonuses based on project completion. Are you interested?" By the time they returned to the ranch that evening, Marcus felt like he was living in a dream. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from sleeping on the streets to having housing, employment, and a support system he'd never imagined possible. But George Sr. wasn't finished. "Marcus, what we've done today is just the beginning. Tomorrow, I want you to meet with Jennifer Collins at the San Antonio Express News. She's going to write a story about what we're doing, but more importantly, she's going to help us reach other veterans who might be in situations similar to yours." "You want to publicize this?" Marcus asked, suddenly uncomfortable. "Not you specifically, if you're not comfortable with that," George Sr. assured him. "But the program we're creating, yes. Because here's the thing, you're not the only veterans struggling right now. There are thousands of men and women who served this country with honor, who are fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight alone." George Jr. added, "We want to create a model that other communities can replicate. If we can make this work in San Antonio, there's no reason it can't work in Houston, Dallas, Austin, and eventually across the entire country." That night, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Marcus found the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on his mind all day. "Why me? I mean, I'm grateful beyond words, but there are thousands of veterans in worse situations than mine. What made you decide to get involved in my specific case?" George Sr. was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You know, Marcus, sometimes life puts people in your path for reasons you don't fully understand at the time. When George Jr. called me yesterday, Something in his voice told me this was important. And when I met you, I saw something that reminded me of my brother when he came back from Vietnam. A good man who'd been through hell and was trying to find his way back to the light. But there's something else, George Jr. added. Yesterday, when you were sitting on that street corner, you maintained your dignity. You weren't aggressive or demanding. You weren't bitter or angry, even though you had every right to be. You were just a man who'd served his country asking for a little help to get back on his feet. That kind of character deserves to be honored, not ignored. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. I don't know how I'll ever repay this kindness. You don't repay it, George Sr. said firmly. You pay it forward. You take what we're giving you, you build something good with it, and then you help the next veteran who needs a hand up. That's how this works. That's how we make sure no one who served this country ever has to face their battles alone. As the stars began to appear in the clear Texas sky, Marcus realized that this wasn't just about one man's rescue from homelessness. This was about creating a movement, a network of support that could transform how America cares for its veterans. And somehow, miraculously, he was going to be at the center of it all. 2 weeks later, the story that Jennifer Collins published in the San Antonio Express-News had gone viral. What started as a local human interest piece about a veteran's rescue from homelessness had been picked up by national news outlets, shared hundreds of thousands of times on social media, and had sparked conversations about veteran care across the country. Marcus found himself at the center of a media storm he never could have anticipated. The transitional housing unit that had become his temporary home was constantly visited by reporters, fellow veterans, and people who simply wanted to meet the man whose story had touched so many hearts. This is overwhelming, Marcus confided to George Jr. as they sat in the small apartment's living room, looking at yet another stack of interview requests. I never wanted to be famous. I just wanted to get back on my feet. George Jr. nodded understandingly. Dad and I have talked about this. We know it's a lot, but Marcus, you have to understand what's happening here. Your story isn't just about you anymore. It's become a symbol of what's possible when people care enough to act. The numbers were staggering. Within 2 weeks of the story's publication, the Strait Family Foundation had received over $2 million in donations specifically designated for veteran support programs. More importantly, they'd been contacted by business owners in dozens of cities who wanted to replicate the San Antonio model in their own communities. Thomas Anderson's construction project had become a case study in how to effectively employ veterans. Marcus's military leadership skills had translated perfectly to construction management, and the project was ahead of schedule and under budget. Anderson had been so impressed that he'd already committed to expanding the program and hiring additional veterans for his other projects. But perhaps the most significant development was entirely unexpected. The VA transitional housing facility where Marcus was staying had become an informal gathering place for other veterans in the area. Word had spread through the veteran community that something special was happening in San Antonio, and men and women from across South Texas were making their way to the city seeking help. Dr. Sarah Chen, the PTSD counselor who had been working with Marcus, approached George Sr. with a proposal that would change everything. "Mr. Strait," she said during a meeting at the ranch, "what we're seeing is unprecedented. We have veterans driving in from Houston, Austin, even as far away as El Paso, because they've heard about the support network you've created here. The demand is far exceeding our capacity to help." George Sr. leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "What are you suggesting, Dr. Chen?" "I'm suggesting we think bigger, much bigger. What if we created a comprehensive veteran support campus? Not just housing, but job training, mental health services, family counseling, and most importantly, a peer support network run by veterans for veterans." Marcus, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "You know, there's something we haven't talked about that might be crucial to making this work." Everyone turned to him, waiting. Most veteran support programs are run by well-meaning civilians who have never served. They mean well, but they don't understand the military mindset, the brotherhood, the specific challenges we face. What if we created a program that was veteran-led from top to bottom? George Jr.'s eyes lit up. "You mean having veterans in leadership positions throughout the organization?" "Exactly," Marcus replied. "Veterans helping veterans, veterans making decisions about veteran programs, veterans who understand what it's like to come home from war and feel like you don't belong anywhere." The idea resonated immediately. Within days, George Sr. had assembled a planning committee that included Marcus, Dr. Chen, Thomas Anderson, Rebecca Martinez from the VA, and several other local business leaders and community activists. But the real breakthrough came when David Rodriguez Sr., the father of Marcus's fallen squad leader, reached out after seeing the news coverage. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while Marcus was reviewing construction schedules for the veteran housing project. When he heard the voice identify itself as David Rodriguez Sr., Marcus felt his chest tighten with familiar guilt and grief. "Sergeant Thompson," the older man said, his voice steady but emotional, "I've been following your story in the news, and I wanted to talk to you." Marcus braced himself for anger, for blame, for the accusations he'd been making against himself for months. Instead, he heard something he never expected. "I want to thank you." "Sir," Marcus stammered, confused. "My son wrote to us about you, Sergeant. He told us about how you looked out for the younger soldiers, how you made sure everyone in the squad felt like family, how you never asked anyone to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. When we lost David, I was angry at everyone and everything. But I was never angry at you because I knew you loved my son like a brother." Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. "Mr. Rodriguez, I should have protected him. I should have seen that IED. I should have—" "Son," David Sr. interrupted gently, "you can't take responsibility for the randomness of war. David knew the risks when he enlisted, just like you did. He died serving his country and protecting his brothers. There's honor in that, not shame." The conversation lasted over an hour, and by the end, David Sr. had made a proposal that would transform the entire veteran support initiative. "I want to establish a foundation in David's name," he said, "and I want to partner with what you and the Straits are doing in San Antonio. My son believed in taking care of his fellow soldiers, and I think this is how we honor that belief." Within a month, the David Rodriguez Foundation had committed $5 million to establishing the Texas Veterans Support Campus in San Antonio. The facility would include transitional housing for up to 200 veterans, job training programs in partnership with local employers, comprehensive mental health services, and most importantly, a peer support program run entirely by veterans. Marcus found himself appointed as the campus director, a responsibility that both thrilled and terrified him. But with the support of the Strait family, the Rodriguez Foundation, and a growing network of community partners, he felt ready for the challenge. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, with Governor Abbott, several members of Congress, and hundreds of veterans and their families in attendance. George Strait performed a special acoustic set, including a new song he'd written called "Brothers Coming Home" that had been inspired by Marcus's story. As Marcus stood at the podium to address the crowd, he looked out at the sea of faces, veterans, family members, community supporters, and media representatives from across the nation. 6 months earlier, he'd been sitting on a street corner, invisible and forgotten. Now, he was leading an effort that would impact thousands of lives. 6 months ago, he began, his voice strong and clear, I was a broken man who had lost hope. I was ready to give up, to disappear into the darkness that follows so many of us home from war. But two people, George Strait Jr. and his father, saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. They saw potential where I saw failure, hope where I saw despair, and purpose where I saw emptiness. He paused, looking directly at the Strait family in the front row. But this campus isn't really about me, and it's not about them either. It's about the promise America makes to every person who raises their right hand and swears to defend this nation. It's about the commitment that no one who serves in our military will ever have to face their battles alone. The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus wasn't finished. This facility will serve as a model for communities across America. We're going to prove that when civilians and veterans work together, when businesses and government and non-profit organizations unite around a common cause, there's no challenge we can't overcome. We're going to make sure that every veteran who needs help knows that there are people who care, people who understand, and people who will stand with them until they're back on their feet. As the ceremony concluded and people began touring the construction site, George Sr. approached Marcus with a smile. "Son, I think David Rodriguez would be proud of what his sacrifice has inspired." Marcus nodded, his eyes moist with emotion. "Mr. Strait, I used to think David died for nothing. Now I understand that he died for everything, for the brotherhood that brings us together, for the values that make us strong, and for the country that gives us the freedom to build something like this." The Texas Veterans Support Campus would open its doors 6 months later, and within the first year, it would have helped over 800 veterans transition successfully back into civilian life. But more importantly, it would inspire similar facilities in Houston, Dallas, Austin, and eventually in cities across the nation. Marcus Thompson, the homeless veteran who had been sitting on a San Antonio street corner, had become the catalyst for a national movement, and it all started with one person caring enough to stop, to listen, and to act. 1 year later, Marcus Thompson stood in his office on the 3rd floor of the Texas Veterans Support Campus, looking out at the bustling community that had grown around the facility. The campus now housed 180 veterans and their families, employed 67 veterans in various capacities, and had successfully transitioned over 1,200 veterans back into stable civilian lives. The morning sun streamed through the windows as Marcus reviewed the latest statistics. The job placement rate was 94%, the housing stability rate was 97%, and perhaps most importantly, the peer support program had reduced veteran suicide attempts among campus residents to 0 over the past 8 months. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, and was surprised to see George Strait Jr. entering with a young woman in military fatigues. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Staff Sergeant Lisa Martinez. She just returned from her 2nd deployment in Iraq, and she's going through some of the same challenges you faced." Lisa Martinez was 26 years old, with the same alert eyes and careful posture that Marcus recognized in so many returning veterans. But there was something else in her expression, a wariness that spoke of recent trauma and fresh wounds. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," Marcus said, extending his hand. "Welcome home. Please have a seat." As Lisa told her story, Marcus heard echoes of his own experience. She'd lost her best friend, Corporal Angela Davis, in a rocket attack on their forward operating base. She'd returned home to find that her civilian friends couldn't understand what she'd been through. Her family treated her like she was fragile and might break at any moment, and employers seemed nervous about hiring someone with combat experience. "I've been sleeping in my car for the past 2 weeks, Lisa admitted, her voice steady, but her hands shaking slightly. "I can't handle the VA shelter, too many people, too much noise. I keep thinking someone's going to attack and I can't turn it off." Marcus nodded understandingly. I know exactly what you mean. When I first got here, I couldn't sleep for weeks because I kept listening for incoming mortars that weren't there. How did you get past it? Lisa asked. Honestly, I didn't get past it. I learned to live with it, but more importantly, I learned that I didn't have to live with it alone. Marcus gestured toward the window, where veterans could be seen walking between buildings, talking in small groups, working on various projects. What makes this place special isn't the buildings or the programs, it's the community. It's being around people who understand what you've been through because they've been through it themselves. Over the next hour, Marcus walked Lisa through the campus, introducing her to other veterans, showing her the various programs and services available, and most importantly, helping her understand that she wasn't alone in her struggles. They stopped by the construction site where Thomas Anderson's company was building additional housing units. The project foreman was Michael Torres, a Marine veteran who had been homeless when he first arrived at the campus 8 months earlier. Now he was leading a team of 12 other veterans in the construction of 50 new apartment units. Lisa, Marcus said, this is Michael Torres. He's been where you are now. Michael wiped his hands on a towel and approached them with a warm smile. Staff Sergeant Martinez, welcome to the campus. Marcus probably told you this, but 8 months ago I was living under an overpass in Austin, convinced that nobody understood what I was going through. What changed? Lisa asked. Same thing that changed for Marcus and for everyone else here. I found out I wasn't alone. I found purpose again. And I found people who wouldn't give up on me even when I'd given up on myself. As they continued the tour, Lisa met Jennifer Walsh, a Navy veteran who now ran the campus's mental health peer support program. David Kim, an Air Force veteran who managed the job placement services. And Sarah Thompson, an Army veteran who coordinated family counseling services. Notice a pattern? Marcus asked as they sat down for lunch in the community dining hall. They're all veterans, Lisa observed. Exactly. We learned early on that the most effective way to help veterans is to have veterans leading the programs. We understand the culture, the mindset, the specific challenges. When Jennifer tells someone that the nightmares will get better, they believe her because they can see that she's survived her own nightmares. After lunch, they visited the campus's newest addition, the David Rodriguez Memorial Workshop, where veterans learned various trade skills while working on community service projects. The current project was rebuilding homes for low-income families affected by recent flooding in East San Antonio. This is incredible, Lisa said, watching as veterans operated sophisticated machinery while helping train newer arrivals. Everyone here seems to have purpose, like they're part of something important. That's exactly the point, Marcus replied. We're not just helping veterans recover from their service, we're helping them continue their service in new ways. Every veteran here is contributing to something bigger than themselves. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus could see Lisa's demeanor beginning to change. The wariness was still there, but it was accompanied by something else. Hope. Their final stop was the campus's crown jewel, the George Strait Community Center, where evening programs brought together veterans, their families, and members of the broader San Antonio community. Tonight was movie night, and families were already beginning to gather for a showing of The Sandlot, chosen specifically because it was wholesome entertainment that wouldn't trigger anyone's PTSD. Mr. Thompson, a small voice called out, and Marcus turned to see 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez running toward him. Emma was the daughter of Carlos Rodriguez, a veteran who had arrived at the campus 6 months earlier with his wife and 3 children after losing his job and apartment. Hey there, Emma. How was school today? Great. I got an A on my math test, and Mrs. Johnson said I could help tutor some of the other kids. Emma beamed with pride, and Marcus felt his heart swell. When Carlos had first arrived, Emma had been withdrawn and anxious, clearly affected by her family's housing instability and her father's struggles with PTSD. Now she was thriving, confident and secure in the stable environment the campus provided. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Is your dad around?" "He's in the workshop with Mr. Kim, learning how to use the computer for job applications. Mom says he has an interview tomorrow at the bank downtown." Marcus smiled. Carlos had been a finance specialist in the army, but had struggled to translate his military experience into civilian job qualifications. With help from the campus's employment services, he'd finally connected with a position that valued his skills and experience. As Emma ran off to join her friends, Lisa turned to Marcus with the expression of wonder. "This isn't just a veteran support facility, is it? It's a real community." "That's exactly what it is," Marcus replied, "and it's exactly what we intended. Veterans don't just need services, they need belonging. They need to feel like they're part of something, like they matter, like their experience has value." That evening, as they sat in the community center watching the movie, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from George Strait Jr. "Dad wants to know if you're free tomorrow afternoon. He has something he wants to discuss with you." The next day, Marcus drove out to the Strait family ranch for the first time in several months. He'd been so busy with the campus operations that he hadn't had much time for social visits, but the Strait family remained closely involved in the project and had become some of his closest friends. George Sr. met him at the door with his characteristic warm smile. "Marcus, son, you look good. The responsibility agrees with you." "Thank you, Mr. Strait. I have to say, I never imagined my life would look like this when you and George Jr. picked me up off that street corner." "Well, that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," George Sr. said, as they settled into the familiar chairs on the front porch. "George Jr. and I have been talking, and we think it's time to take this to the next level." Marcus felt a familiar flutter of nervous excitement. "What do you mean?" George Jr. joined them, carrying a folder thick with papers and documents. "We've been contacted by groups in 47 states wanting to replicate what we've built here in San Antonio. The Department of Veterans Affairs wants to make our model the template for veteran support programs nationwide, and we've been invited to present to Congress about implementing similar programs in every major city in America." Marcus felt overwhelmed. "That's incredible, but I'm not sure I'm the right person to be leading something that big." George Sr. leaned forward, his expression serious. "Marcus, let me ask you something. A year ago, when you were sitting on that street corner, what did you think you needed most?" "Hope," Marcus replied without hesitation. "I needed to believe that things could get better." "And what did we give you?" Marcus thought for a moment. "You gave me hope, but more than that, you gave me purpose. You made me feel like my experience, my skills, my service still mattered." "Exactly," George Jr. said, "and that's what makes you the perfect person to lead this expansion. You're not just someone who was helped, you're someone who understands how to help others in the same situation." Over the next 2 hours, they outlined an ambitious plan. The Strait Family Foundation, in partnership with the David Rodriguez Foundation and several major corporate sponsors, would establish veteran support campuses in 25 cities over the next 5 years. Each campus would be modeled on the San Antonio facility, but adapted to the specific needs and resources of its local community. Marcus would serve as the national director, overseeing the expansion while maintaining his role at the San Antonio campus. It was a massive responsibility, but as George Sr. pointed out, it was also an unprecedented opportunity to impact the lives of thousands of veterans across the country. "There's one more thing," George Sr. said as their meeting wound down. "We want to establish the Marcus Thompson Institute for Veteran Leadership. It would be a training program for veterans who want to take leadership roles in veteran support organizations. You'd be the director, and you'd train the next generation of veteran advocates. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever dreamed possible. Don't say anything yet, George Jr. advised. Think about it. Talk to Lisa and the other veterans at the campus. This decision affects all of them too. That evening, Marcus called an all-hands meeting at the campus. The community center was packed with veterans, family members, staff, and volunteers, as Marcus explained the opportunity and the choice they faced. This expansion would mean that thousands of veterans across the country would have access to the same support, the same community, the same opportunities that we've built here, he explained. But it would also mean changes for us. Some of our best people would need to relocate to help establish programs in other cities. We'd need to train new leaders, develop new systems, and maintain our standards across multiple locations. Jennifer Walsh, the mental health coordinator, raised her hand. Marcus, you're talking about this like it's a difficult choice, but it seems obvious to me. We have something here that works. If we can share it with veterans in other cities, how is that even a question? Michael Torres nodded in agreement. When I first got here, you told me that the goal wasn't just to help me get back on my feet. The goal was to help me become someone who could help others get back on their feet. This expansion is exactly that principle on a national scale. David Kim, the employment coordinator, stood up. I vote yes. And I volunteer to help establish the first campus in Dallas. My brother lives there, and he tells me there are hundreds of veterans who could benefit from what we're doing here. One by one, the veterans in the room voiced their support. Not just support, enthusiasm. They understood that what they'd built in San Antonio wasn't meant to be hoarded or protected. It was meant to be shared, replicated, and spread to every corner of the country where veterans needed help. Lisa Martinez, who had only been at the campus for a week, stood up last. I know I haven't been here long, but I want to say something. A week ago, I was sleeping in my car, convinced that nobody understood what I was going through. Today, I'm sitting in a room full of people who not only understand, but who have built something amazing from their own struggles. If we can do that for veterans in other cities, then we have an obligation to do it. Marcus looked around the room at the faces of people who had become more than colleagues or program participants. They had become family. They were right, of course. What they'd built wasn't meant to be kept to themselves. All right, he said, his voice strong and clear. Let's change the world. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the stage at the Republican National Convention, having been invited to speak about veteran support as an example of successful public-private partnerships. As he looked out at the massive audience, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 2 years ago, he began, I was a homeless veteran sitting on a street corner in San Antonio, invisible to a world that seemed to have forgotten I existed. Today, I stand before you as the director of a program that has helped over 3,000 veterans transition back into productive civilian lives. He paused, scanning the crowd until he found the faces he was looking for. George Strait and George Jr., sitting in the VIP section with David Rodriguez Sr. and the families of dozens of veterans who had been helped by their programs. But this story isn't really about me, he continued. It's about what happens when ordinary Americans decide that our veterans deserve more than just our gratitude. They deserve our action. It's about what happens when successful people use their resources and influence, not just to make themselves richer or more famous, but to make their communities stronger and more compassionate. The speech lasted 15 minutes, but the impact was immediate and lasting. Within 24 hours, Marcus had received calls from governors, mayors, business leaders, and veteran organizations in all 50 states. The Marcus Thompson Institute for Veteran Leadership was officially established with an initial endowment of $50 million from various donors. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came after the speech, when a young veteran approached Marcus in the hallway outside the convention center. "Mr. Thompson," the young man said, "my name is Robert Williams. I served in Syria, came home 8 months ago, and I've been struggling to find my place. I saw your speech on TV, and I wanted to ask, is there room in your program for one more?" Marcus smiled, remembering his own desperation on that street corner 2 years earlier, and George Jr.'s simple act of compassion that had changed everything. "Son," he said, placing his hand on Robert's shoulder, "there's always room for one more. That's what this is all about, making sure no veteran ever has to face their battles alone." As they walked together toward the exit, Marcus reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. From homeless veteran to national advocate, from broken man to community leader, from invisible and forgotten to a voice for thousands of Americans who had served their country with honor. It all started with one person who cared enough to stop, to listen, and to act. And now, that single act of compassion had grown into a national movement that would impact the lives of veterans for generations to come. George Strait Jr. had seen a veteran starving and called his father. What they did together hadn't left everyone scared. It had left everyone inspired. And that inspiration would continue to spread, one veteran at a time, one community at a time, until no American hero would ever have to fight their battles alone. The story was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning.